In the silence of sealed vaults and forgotten bunkers, whispers travel like ghosts through corridors no map will mark. What lingers is not the roar of battles remembered, but the low hum of files withheld, transmissions unanswered, and machinery that seemed to breathe long after its makers were gone. Imagine the pages of a book deliberately torn out, leaving only the smell of ink and ash, daring you to guess what words once lived there. Within these fractures lie fragments of truth too dangerous to speak plainly, and yet too insistent to bury forever. They emerge as shadows coded in static, pressed into reels of film never shown, locked away not by accident but by design. If knowledge is power, then silence is a weapon, and the line between the two is drawn with black ink across redacted pages. To follow these trails is to step into a world where the war never truly ended, only vanished into darker rooms. Chapter 1. Shadows Beneath Operation Paperclip. In May 1945, the ruins of Nazi Germany smouldered across a shattered continent. Entire cities lay in rubble. Wehrmacht units surrendered in pockets, and civilians wandered in silence, displaced by the millions. Yet as Allied soldiers stood victorious, another, quieter mission was already unfolding behind closed doors. It would never appear in the official headlines of victory. It was called Operation Paperclip, and it would bring some of the most notorious scientists of the Third Reich into the very heart of the United States, disguised as assets rather than war criminals. The official narrative that filtered into public consciousness decades later spoke of brilliant minds fueling the space race. Men like Wernher von Braun and Arthur Rudolph, who helped launch rockets that would eventually reach the moon. But beneath that sanitized version lay a darker record, one contained in classified memoranda, suppressed testimonies, and files marked eyes only. What was brought across the Atlantic was not merely technical expertise, but men steeped in war crimes. Men who carried with them blueprints for weapons and experiments that blurred the line between science and atrocity. The roots of Paperclip can be traced to a directive signed in July 1945 by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, itself a branch cobbled together from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and Army G2. The order was explicit: locate, detain, and transfer German scientists with specialized knowledge before the Soviets could capture them. The rationale was strategic. America feared falling behind in missile technology, chemical warfare, and aeronautics. Yet the haste with which the operation was conducted meant that the moral screening process was all but discarded. A series of memos uncovered decades later reveal how dossiers marked red, meaning suspect for war crimes or party membership, were altered, rewritten, or erased to read white. Even SS officers who had overseen slave labor camps were rebranded as apolitical technicians. By 1946, over 1,600 individuals had been relocated to the United States under new employment contracts, many with fabricated personal histories prepared by army clerks. The most notorious of these men was Wernher von Braun, technical director of the V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde. The V-2 missile, hailed as the world's first ballistic missile, was manufactured not in gleaming laboratories, but in the underground tunnels of Mittelwerk, constructed by the hands of prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Survivors later testified that thousands perished in those tunnels from exhaustion, starvation, and summary execution. Yet in September 1945, von Braun was flown to Fort Bliss, Texas, where he began working for the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, as if his past had been severed from the steel and concrete of Dora. When the subject of slave labor arose during vetting interviews, Army officers quietly noted the testimony and filed it away under sensitive do not circulate. In their view, the future of missile technology outweighed the testimony of survivors. Von Braun was not the only one. Arthur Rudolph, operations director of Mittelwerk, followed him. In later years, Rudolph would be called the father of the Saturn V, the rocket that carried Apollo 11 into space. What never appeared in press photographs was his signature on documents requisitioning thousands of forced laborers under brutal conditions. A classified Army Review Board in 1947 openly acknowledged Rudolph's role in inhumane labor practices, yet concluded, in a handwritten note, his value to current projects supersedes negative factors. The note was signed and stamped with the insignia of the Joe. WWII, Soviets pursued their own program of abduction and recruitment, under Operation Osławiakim in October 1946, forcibly transferring thousands of German specialists and their families into the Soviet Union. Stalin's men emptied factories, laboratories, and university departments, leaving entire towns stripped of their technical class overnight. The result was a shadow war between East and West, a race not only for knowledge, but for the men themselves. Intelligence cables intercepted in 1947 detail attempted kidnappings of German scientists living under American custody, with NKVD operatives posing as displaced persons in post-war Germany. At least 3 attempted abductions ended in gunfire near Munich, though the incidents were written off as civilian disturbances. Beyond rockets and engineering, Paperclip pulled in experts from fields that never reached the public record. Files from Camp King in Oberursel describe interrogations of men involved in chemical warfare research, particularly on nerve agents like tabun and sarin. IG Farben scientists, some of whom stood trial at Nuremberg, were quietly reassigned to American chemical weapons labs at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. An internal memo dated April 1948 warns of morale issues among army chemists who objected to working alongside men they believed should have been hanged. The complaint was ignored. Even darker were the human experiments imported under the guise of medical research. Declassified fragments from Project Bluebird and later MK-Ultra referenced German physicians brought into the fold, their experience in hypothermia, altitude tolerance, and chemical conditioning deemed uniquely valuable. Where they had once frozen or poisoned unwilling camp inmates, they were now asked to consult on interrogation-resistant studies for the CIA. The public narrative of Paperclip would not be questioned until the late 1970s, when journalists and investigators began to piece together fragments of what had been suppressed. The Washington Post and the New York Times unearthed portions of JIOA documents, forcing official acknowledgement of Paperclip's scope. Yet even then, significant details remained classified. Survivors from Dora, Dachau, and Ravensbrück filed testimonies describing the men they had seen in camp uniforms, now paraded as pioneers of space travel. Their accounts were often dismissed as confused memory, a phrase repeated in Army memoranda to deflect attention. Congressional hearings in 1985 brought Arthur Rudolph under investigation, resulting in his quiet denaturalization and departure to West Germany, where he lived unprosecuted until his death in 1996. Von Braun, celebrated as the architect of Apollo, had already died in 1977, his reputation largely untarnished in the public eye. The files that remain buried paint an even grimmer picture. Classified reports from White Sands Proving Ground in 1946 described test flights conducted by German engineers under minimal oversight. Several rockets exploded over uninhabited stretches of New Mexico, scattering debris that civilian ranchers stumbled upon. A recovered fragment bore stenciled markings identical to those used at Mittelwerk. The report was stamped secret and filed away under Army Ordnance Archives. Another memorandum, dated 1949, refers to excess casualties during a classified field test in Nevada, though details are redacted. The file remains locked under exemption clauses of the Freedom of Information Act, shielded by national security. Operation Paperclip did more than accelerate America's technological edge. It blurred the line between victor and vanquished, between war crime and national interest. It allowed men once loyal to Hitler to rebrand themselves as guardians of Western progress, their past erased by the stroke of a pen. The consequences rippled through the Cold War. Missiles that threatened Moscow were born from the same minds that once targeted London. NASA's crowning achievements were inseparable from the shadows of Dora's tunnels, and behind every sanitized press release lay files stamped with black ink, locked in vaults that even decades later remain partially sealed. The question that lingers is not whether Paperclip was successful, it undoubtedly was, but what was sacrificed in pursuit of that success. When military necessity outweighs justice, archives become graves of memory, and silence becomes the currency of power. Paperclip was not an anomaly of history, but a blueprint for how nations bury the inconvenient truths of war. Its shadows stretch far beyond 1945, lingering in documents still classified, waiting in the dark recesses of state archives, where the cost of victory remains written in files no one is meant to read. Chapter 2. The Vanished Convoy of Narvik Fjord. On the morning of 9th April 1940, the still waters of Narvik Fjord were torn apart by the thunder of naval gunfire. German destroyers of Group 1, under the command of Commodore Friedrich Bonte, had entered the fjord carrying mountain troops tasked with seizing control of the vital port. For days, the British Royal Navy clashed with the Kriegsmarine in icy waters, and official histories record the destruction of 10 German destroyers and the loss of countless merchantmen. Yet among the destroyed manifests and incomplete reports, one vessel remained conspicuously absent. It was designated only as Transport 46, its purpose never detailed in German naval archives. The ship does not appear on Kriegsmarine loss rolls, nor does it appear in post-war Allied summaries of the battle. It existed in the paperwork of convoys routed through Narvik in March 1940, and then vanished into silence. For decades, its story survived only in fragments, declassified Admiralty cables, scattered reports from Norwegian resistance, and Soviet intelligence files that hint at a cargo so sensitive it warranted erasure from history itself. British intercepts from the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park first mentioned Transport 46 in early April, in decrypts of Enigma signals routed through Kriegsmarine Group West. The message referenced special freight to be secured in Narvik, under the authority of the Reich Ministry for Armaments and War Production. What distinguished the signal was the chain of authority. It bypassed naval channels entirely, instead bearing the initials of SS General Hans Kammler, an officer later linked to projects involving V-weapons and underground facilities. Analysts flagged the message, but amid the chaos of the Norwegian campaign, it was filed into a backlog of untranslated intercepts. By the time the file was reviewed in London weeks later, Transport 46 had disappeared from all surviving records. Local testimony from Narvik tells a different story. Resistance fighter Olaf Henriksson, whose diary was smuggled to Stockholm in June 1940, described a heavily guarded unloading operation on the night of 10th April. He noted SS men in black uniforms disembarking with sealed steel crates, each carried by 6 soldiers, escorted under floodlights to trucks that departed toward the mountain passes south of Narvik. Henriksson claimed civilians were ordered indoors at gunpoint during the operation, and that the next morning the vessel was deliberately scuttled near Framnes. When Allied forces regained partial control of Narvik weeks later, no trace of such cargo was ever found. Henriksson was later captured by the Gestapo and died in Sachsenhausen, his diary surviving only through microfilm copied by Swedish intelligence. Declassified British Admiralty cables from 1943 provide additional fragments. An internal memorandum titled Narvik Convoys, Irregularities in Loss Accounting notes the unexplained absence of a merchant transport despite photographic reconnaissance, suggesting 11 vessels destroyed rather than the officially listed 10. Rear Admiral William Whitworth, who commanded British forces in the Second Naval Battle of Narvik, later told an intelligence debriefing that the German tally never squared with what we saw burning in the fjord. The report was stamped secret and circulated only within Naval Intelligence Division. In margin notes, one officer speculated that the missing vessel might have been a blockade runner carrying rare ores. Another annotation, later crossed out in pencil, read simply, Kammler. The Soviet Union's archives add a more sinister dimension. In the 1960s, defectors from the GRU described files in Moscow referring to Project Morgenrot, an operation involving shipments from Norway to the Reich. The codename translates to morning, red, and documents listed it under Kammler's authority. According to their testimony, the GRU believed Morgenrot involved either advanced metallurgical materials or prototype weapon components moved from coastal facilities in Norway. Soviet patrols that entered Narvik after the German withdrawal allegedly recovered fragments of one steel container, lined with lead and bearing a stenciled eagle insignia. The container was shipped to Murmansk for further analysis, though no surviving record describes its contents. In Moscow, the matter was categorized under the rubric of special technology and buried in files accessible only to the Ministry of Defense. The trail in Western archives grows thinner but no less disturbing. An OSS field report from Stockholm, dated July 1940, mentions rumors of a German transport carrying archival material and experimental equipment evacuated from Oslo prior to the invasion. Norwegian intelligence sources linked the shipment to a university research institute commandeered by German forces months earlier. The report was passed to London but marked uncorroborated. After the war, when Allied war crimes investigators sought to reconstruct the activities of Kammler's units, they found entire months of documentation missing, particularly regarding projects connected to Narvik. Witnesses were either dead, disappeared, or unwilling to speak. Kamler himself reportedly committed suicide in May 1945, though no body was ever recovered. What is certain is that Transport 46 was erased not only from Kriegsmarine records, but also from Allied post-war histories. Naval historians, writing in the 1950s, produced detailed accounts of the battles of Narvik without a single mention of the ship. When confronted decades later with declassified intercepts, surviving naval officers claimed ignorance. Some suggested clerical error. Others admitted that special cargoes were sometimes omitted intentionally to avoid questions of accountability. By the 1980s, the narrative of Transport 46 had become a subject of speculation among researchers of Nazi secret projects, often drowned in conspiracy theories. Yet the primary evidence, the intercepts, the diaries, the cables, points consistently to a vessel removed deliberately from the historical record. Today, the Fjord still holds wrecks of German destroyers, visible beneath the icy water to divers and maritime archaeologists. Yet the resting place of Transport 46 has never been conclusively identified. Sonar surveys conducted in the 1990s mapped several scuttled hulls near Framnes, but none matched the dimensions described in Norwegian eyewitness accounts. Requests for declassification of further Admiralty files have been denied under national security exemptions, citing ongoing relevance to defense intelligence. Similarly, Russian archival requests regarding Morgenrot remain unanswered. The absence of evidence has not closed the case, but rather deepened the void around it. The vanished convoy of Narvik Fjord is more than an isolated anomaly. It illustrates the machinery of secrecy that operated during the Second World War, a machinery in which inconvenient ships and their cargoes could vanish, not only beneath the waves, but from the written record itself. Whether Transport 46 carried experimental weapon components, scientific archives, or something more elusive, its erasure suggests an intentional concealment by both Axis and Allied hands. In the quiet waters of the fjord, beneath the snow-capped mountains where battles once raged, the unanswered question lingers. What was hidden in the crates marked Morgenrot, and why was it worth silencing for generations? Until the archives yield their final pages, Transport 46 remains a ghost ship of the Second World War, its cargo locked away not in steel but in silence. Chapter 3. Silence over Operation Northwind Files. On 1st January 1945, the German army launched what would be its last major offensive on the Western Front. Known as Operation Northwind, the attack was meant to relieve pressure from the failing Ardennes campaign and shatter American and French positions in Alsace. Official histories describe a desperate, conventional strike. Infantry divisions supported by armor attempting to break through thinly stretched US lines. Yet buried in after-action reports, field intelligence notes, and sealed communications lies a far more unsettling narrative. Within the chaos of the offensive, an element of secrecy existed that was never acknowledged in public accounts, one that left behind inexplicable gaps in records and a village erased from maps. The 7th US Army, under General Alexander Patch, bore the brunt of Northwind's assault. American units like the 79th Infantry Division and 45th Infantry Division fought in bitter winter conditions against determined German attacks. South of Haguenau, in a village that had been home to fewer than 200 residents, something unfolded that still resists explanation. Wehrmacht documents later uncovered in Freiburg contain references to orders bypassing normal command chains. The 21st Mountain Corps, under General der Gebirgstruppen Friedrich Petersen, received instructions from the OKW marked Nur durch Offizier, for officer delivery only. The sealed orders directed one of Petersen's regiments not toward an American-held strongpoint, but into the civilian heart of the village, where they were to secure and hold a series of abandoned farmhouses and a church basement. No further detail was provided. Witness accounts from German prisoners of war, interviewed weeks later by US G2 officers, described the detachment as reinforced by SS communications specialists carrying unfamiliar radio equipment. The battle for Alsace was bitter, marked by snow, fog, and brutal house-to-house fighting. American patrols of the 314th Infantry Regiment reported encountering unusual German resistance in the village sector, including sudden artillery fire seemingly directed with uncanny accuracy. More troubling was the collapse of US fire coordination during the engagement. An after-action report from the 79th Division's Artillery Battalion noted persistent interference across multiple frequencies, making it impossible to relay fire adjustments. Shelling fell short or overshot targets, endangering American infantry. For 48 hours, command channels were disrupted. Technicians from Signal Corps units recorded bursts of static and tonal distortions that did not match known German jamming methods. One officer described it as a signal source locked into our command net, not blocking but bending the traffic. The episode was classified and submitted to 7th Army headquarters with a recommendation for further investigation. The file was later marked confidential and sealed in Army intelligence archives. When the snow cleared and US forces retook the village in mid-January, they found little but devastation. Entire civilian families were missing, their homes stripped bare. Church records and municipal files were gone, removed or burned. The few survivors claimed the SS had deported villagers in trucks heading east, though no transport manifests or Red Cross records exist to confirm their fate. American units discovered destroyed communications gear in the rubble of the farmhouse cellars, charred beyond identification. A handful of steel cases were recovered, bearing stenciled serial numbers unfamiliar to Army ordnance officers. Within days, Counterintelligence Corps, CIC detachments arrived and sealed the site. Their final report remains heavily redacted, with whole pages struck out under security, exemptions when released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act. French authorities attempted to investigate the disappearance of the village records after the war. Requests were filed with US Army Archives in 1947, but the reply from American authorities described the matter as closed, citing operational necessity during active combat. In 1952, French gendarmes compiled testimony from displaced villagers that described radio towers erected in the fields by SS troops during the occupation, dismantled and removed within days. The testimonies were quietly shelved, and by the late 1950s, the village itself had been administratively absorbed into neighboring communes, its name no longer appearing on official maps. For survivors, it was as though their home had been erased. American files declassified in the 1990s under Executive Order 2958 reveal fragments of what may have occurred. A 7th Army G2 situation report, dated 6th January 1945, references German experimental command disruption assets and notes temporary compromise of artillery fire net, suspected field test. Another file, written by a Signal Corps officer in 1946, concludes that the Germans may have employed directional, ultra-high-frequency transmissions in conjunction with captured Allied equipment. The officer's memorandum was classified secret and distributed only to Army. Electronics Command, later handwritten notes in the margin, added in the 1950s, speculate that the technology had been transferred through captured German scientists under Project Paperclip. The suggestion was never confirmed. What lends further weight to the mystery is the silence surrounding Operation Northwind in post-war German testimonies. During the Nuremberg trials, German generals gave extensive detail about Ardennes, but when questioned about Northwind, references to unusual communications detachments or sealed orders vanished. Files from the Bundesarchiv indicate that relevant OKW orders for December 1944 and January 1945 are missing, especially those bearing Kammler's signature. In one surviving Wehrmacht signal log, a reference appears to Einsatzmorgenleiter, but no definition is attached. The log was stamped "Destroy after transmission," yet the fragments survived in microfilm captured by Allied intelligence. The term never reappears elsewhere. By the time Cold War analysts revisited the Northwind files in the 1960s, the event had taken on the aura of a suppressed case study. A CIA memorandum from 1967, later declassified, briefly reviewed wartime German efforts in signal bending and cited a January 1945 field deployment as the first practical test. The location and unit were not specified. The document's final paragraph recommended further exploitation of captured German expertise, noting that legacy files remain restricted to counterintelligence holdings. The implication was clear. The silence around Northwind was deliberate, a function not of oversight but of ongoing utility. Today, the village south of Haguenau survives only in fragments, church ruins overgrown by trees, a collapsed farmhouse foundation, scattered gravestones. Survivors who were children at the time recall trucks, soldiers, and sudden disappearance. Historians who seek to reconstruct the battle confront a wall of missing files and unexplained deletions. In the official US Army Green Books, Operation Northwind is portrayed as a desperate, chaotic battle with little strategic consequence. What is absent are the reports of silenced radios, erratic artillery, and sealed crates of destroyed communications gear. What is absent is the village itself. The silence over Operation Northwind is not the silence of ignorance but of deliberate concealment. It was the closing act of a war fought not only with tanks and rifles, but with shadows of technology and experiments that slipped through the cracks of official memory. In the cold winter of 1945, as the Reich collapsed around them, German units field-tested something on the snowy fields of Alsace. What exactly they unleashed remains locked in redacted files, the truth sealed beneath layers of ink and bureaucracy. For the civilians who vanished and the soldiers whose radios turned to static, the silence is not an abstraction. It is the absence of names, of records, of acknowledgement. It is a silence imposed, one that endures long after the snow of Alsace melted away. Chapter 4. The Disappearance of Unit Kassandra. By late 1944, the German Reich was collapsing on every front. The Allies had pushed through France and into Belgium, while the Soviets advanced relentlessly toward East Prussia. Yet amid this chaos, intelligence intercepts began referencing an SS unit that seemed to operate outside the normal chain of command. It was called Kassandra. The name surfaced in intercepted Enigma traffic, decrypted at Bletchley Park, though the context was fragmentary. Mentions of convoys near Florence, coded shipments routed through Trieste, and personnel movements listed under the SS Ahnenerbe, Heinrich Himmler's notorious research bureau. Officially, no German unit carried that designation. After the war, investigators searching for traces of Kassandra found almost nothing. What remained were scattered reports, missing files, and testimonies that hint at a detachment tasked not with combat, but with securing knowledge, artifacts, and technologies the regime wanted hidden. The earliest traceable reference to Unit Kassandra appears in a December 1943 OSS intercept sent from the American legation in Bern. A coded message relayed from Italian partisans described a convoy of black uniformed SS men accompanied by trucks carrying crates covered in canvas tarps, escorted through Florence under heavy guard. Local witnesses noted the convoy halted at the Basilica of San Miniato al Monte before continuing north. Days later, Allied bombers targeted a nearby rail yard, but no record exists of destroyed SS vehicles. The OSS summary concluded that the cargo was non-standard, possibly archival. Months later, in May 1944, SOE agents in northern Italy reported intercepting Kassandra personnel near Udine, carrying documents written in archaic German mixed with scientific notations. The agents smuggled fragments of these documents to London. Handwritten in the margin of one intercepted page was the phrase Klangversuch, sound experiment. British intelligence officers attached to SOE later described their encounters with Kassandra operatives as unusually unsettling. They reported that captured documents referred to acoustic weaponry, concepts involving the use of concentrated sound waves to disable or disorient. A field report filed by SOE Section D in July 1944 stated, recovered manuscripts describe directed sonic projection and its possible effect on mass psychology. Scientists consulted at the time dismissed the documents as pseudoscience, but the originals were forwarded to MI6 archives. Those documents have never been located again. Inquiries decades later by parliamentary researchers into the whereabouts of the Klangversuch papers were answered with terse denials. No such files located. By early 1945, Kassandra's movements placed them further north, shadowing German withdrawals through the Alps. US 10th Mountain Division patrols advancing into northern Italy reported finding deserted monasteries whose vaults had been cleared of manuscripts and relics. One patrol diary from March 1945 noted traces of SS presence, wax seals broken, reliquaries missing, scorch marks on stone. Among the items left behind was a burned fragment of a photograph showing officers in SS uniforms loading crates marked with the double rune insignia of the Ahnenerbe. American intelligence officers filed the find as Exhibit 452B, though it was later removed from case files by unknown personnel. The only surviving copy appears today in microfilm preserved at the National Archives, labelled Classified Exhibit Withdrawn. Innsbruck became the final confirmed waypoint for Unit Kassandra. In May 1945, US 103rd Infantry Division intercepted a train convoy carrying both Wehrmacht personnel and SS archives. Among the captured materials was a cargo manifest with the designation Kassandra, listing 15 crates under the authority of the Reich Research Council. The crates were loaded onto trucks for transfer to a US Army intelligence depot. Yet when those trucks reached Munich, the crates had vanished. Official records from the 103rd Division note only miscellaneous captured materials. An after-action report written by CIC detachment officers acknowledged the crates but noted their disappearance without further explanation. The report was stamped secret, and all references to Kassandra ceased thereafter. Attempts to trace Kassandra after the war met silence. Nuremberg prosecutors searching for Ahnenerbe evidence encountered deliberate obfuscation. Files requested from US custody were unavailable, while French investigators reported being denied access to army depots. When they pressed further, officials claimed the files had been destroyed for lack of evidentiary value. By the 1960s, rumors circulated within West German intelligence that surviving members of Unit Kassandra had been recruited into classified programs. The Bundesnachrichtendienst opened an internal file under the code K-Referat, though its contents remain sealed. A 1972 parliamentary inquiry into Nazi research programs briefly mentioned Kassandra before all discussion was moved to closed session. No transcript was released. The testimonies of civilians hint at the darker edge of Kassandra's work. In Trieste, a surviving priest told investigators in 1947 that SS men removed books and instruments from a monastery crypt, leaving behind only corpses of partisan prisoners. In Florence, residents recalled screams from beneath the basilica on the night the convoy halted there, though these accounts were dismissed as unreliable. In Friuli, villagers spoke of machines that made the ears bleed, stories so strange that Allied interrogators filed them as folk rumor. Yet when compared with intercepted manuscripts referencing sonic projection and psychological disruption, the accounts take on a more chilling resonance. Declassified CIA files from the 1950s shed a final light on the matter. A memorandum titled Foreign Scientific Assets briefly mentions German work in acoustic field manipulation, citing documents acquired from Special SS Detachment. Designation Kassandra, the memo acknowledges the materials, were incorporated into early psychological warfare studies but notes the originals were destroyed to prevent contamination of scientific integrity. The file ends abruptly, with the last page heavily redacted. It remains unclear how much of Kassandra's research survived and how much was deliberately buried. The disappearance of Unit Kassandra is not simply the story of an obscure SS group lost in the war's chaos. It is a case study in deliberate erasure, crates intercepted and vanished, manuscripts smuggled and lost, testimonies collected and dismissed. Every trace suggests Kassandra's work touched on technologies that straddled the border between science and mythology, experiments on sound, mind, and fear itself. Whether these efforts ever produced practical weapons is unknown. What is certain is that the Allies treated the materials with sufficient gravity to conceal them, and in doing so ensured the unit would dissolve into obscurity. Today, the name Kassandra survives only in scattered documents and whispers in archives, a ghost of the Reich's obsession with knowledge that should never have been pursued. What they carried, and why it was silenced, remains a question locked in vaults, a disappearance engineered not by war, but by those who inherited its secrets. Chapter 5. Ghost Signals of the Baltic Coast. In January 1945, as the Reich collapsed in blood and snow, Soviet listening stations along the Baltic coast began intercepting transmissions that did not match any known German communication pattern. The operators, veterans of countless nights intercepting Enigma and Wehrmacht field chatter, described them as bursts of numbers, followed by long, distorted mechanical tones. Each sequence repeated at exact 7-hour intervals, beginning at 0300 hours, then again at 1000, and again at 1700. The origin was traced to somewhere near Peenemünde, the German rocket development center on the island of Usedom, already infamous as the birthplace of the V2. But when Red Army units captured the area in May, the bunkers that supposedly housed the signal stations were found flooded, their tunnels dynamited, their equipment removed. The transmissions, however, did not stop. They continued for 2 more years, baffling cryptographers in both Moscow and Washington. A Soviet intercept log preserved in the Central Archives of the Ministry of Defense records the first contact with what analysts dubbed the Seawolf signal. The log entry for 12th of January 1945 describes machine-coded voice-like distortion, following numeric preambles, carrier strength moderate, frequency oscillating between 8.9 and 9.1 MHz. Analysts suspected experimental jamming or deception methods, yet attempts to triangulate the signal produced contradictory results, with bearings alternating between the Peenemünde coast and points further offshore. Naval patrols deployed to investigate reported nothing but static. In March 1945, an NKVD field team at Swinemünde attempted a ground intercept, only to vanish during the Soviet advance. Their final transmission was a half-deciphered string of numbers cut off mid-sentence. Their disappearance was logged, but never investigated. Captured Wehrmacht technicians provided fragments of explanation. During interrogations at Rembertov in April 1945, one signal officer admitted that the program was code-named Project Seawolf. He claimed it was designed as a fail-safe communication system using ultra-long-range bursts that would remain undetectable to Allied monitoring. He insisted it was overseen not by the Luftwaffe or Wehrmacht, but by the SS, specifically Kammler's command structure. When pressed about the equipment, he described underground transmitters shielded by seawater, powered by generators hidden in flooded tunnels. Whether true or not, his testimony aligned with Soviet reports of flooded bunkers. The officer died during transport before further interrogation. American records confirm that they too monitored the signals. In June 1945, US Navy intercept stations in Scotland and Greenland recorded transmissions identical to the Soviet reports. A declassified Office of Naval Intelligence memorandum dated 15 August 1945 refers to unidentified Baltic origin coded pulses and warns of possible Soviet deception. The document notes that the signals were first logged while German resistance still lingered, but continued months after unconditional surrender. The Navy's attempts to intercept the origin with destroyers in the Baltic failed. Logs from the USS Charles J. Badger record patrols conducted in December 1946, searching for phantom source broadcasts. Nothing was found but interference and silence. The files were stamped secret and buried in Navy communications archives. Cryptographers across both blocks attempted to solve the puzzle. At Moscow's 16th Directorate, teams worked night and day transcribing numeric bursts. Patterns emerged, repeating sets of 5 digits, consistent with number station protocols, but followed by distorted tones that resembled mechanical voices. Western analysts later described the sound as a broken harmonium in static. Attempts to decode the numbers yielded gibberish. In Washington, the Army Security Agency circulated transcripts under the heading Ghost Broadcasts. Analysts suspected they might be remnants of a German stay-behind network, though the persistence and power of the signal exceeded anything plausible for isolated cells. The transmissions continued relentlessly until October 1947. Then, without warning, they stopped. To this day, neither Soviet nor American files provide definitive explanations. A partially declassified CIA memorandum from 1951, titled Residual Axis Communications, lists Seawolf as an unresolved anomaly. The memo notes, persistence beyond Reich surrender, suggests either autonomous automated broadcast system or covert continuation by unidentified actors. The possibility of autonomous equipment, machines left running in hidden bunkers, was debated but never proven. Engineers questioned how such systems could operate for years without resupply. Another hypothesis suggested the broadcasts were deliberate Soviet fabrications designed to unsettle Western intelligence. But declassified Soviet files indicate their own analysts were equally baffled, treating Seawolf as a serious security concern rather than a deception tool. Civilian accounts from the Baltic coast add another layer of mystery. Fishermen from Usedom recalled strange humming vibrations at night in 1946, as though engines were running deep beneath the waves. Local villagers reported interference with radios, sudden bursts of static followed by distorted voices that frightened children. Some even claimed the tones carried words in fractured German, though no transcripts record coherent phrases. Allied censors dismissed these reports as rumor, yet they align with the timing of recorded transmissions. By the early 1950s, mention of the signals disappeared entirely from both Soviet and American files, as though erased by bureaucratic order. Maritime surveys decades later discovered unexploded ordnance and collapsed tunnel entrances around Peenemünde, confirming the Reich had destroyed large sections of its coastal research facilities. Yet no remains of transmitting equipment were found. Divers in the 1990s, exploring flooded bunkers, discovered rusted power cables leading into sealed shafts, but German and Soviet demolitions had rendered them inaccessible. Requests to declassify further files under Germany's Federal Archives Act were denied on grounds of national security. The Cold War had ended, but the documents remained locked. The ghost signals of the Baltic are remembered today only in scattered declassified intercept logs and fading witness accounts. They represent a rare case where two superpowers, bitterly opposed, encountered the same anomaly and arrived at the same silence. If Seawolf was an SS experiment, it succeeded beyond its war. If it was merely an automated transmitter left running, its endurance defied logic. And if it was something else, something deliberately concealed, it remains hidden in archives stamped secret, buried as carefully as the bunkers beneath the Baltic coast. For the operators who once listened in the frozen nights, the memory was not of triumph, but of unease. A machine voice whispering through static long after the war was supposed to be over, a reminder that in the ruins of the Reich, some signals refused to die. When the last gun fell silent, it was not peace that settled over the world, but a silence filled with locked drawers and unanswered signals. The war left more than ruins. It left questions, threads pulled taut, then cut before they could reveal where they led. Some shadows cling too tightly to be dissolved by time, hiding not in the open battlefield, but in the folds of secrecy, where memory is erased and truth becomes untraceable. What remains are echoes, faint signals without a sender, orders without signatures, places erased from maps yet remembered in fear. They wait in archives and deep water, whispering through the cracks of official history, daring those who listen to piece together the fragments. And in that search lies the most unsettling truth of all. Some stories were never meant to be uncovered, and some doors should never be opened once closed.